Okay, so I'm back, yes, and I want to start out with thinking about how it is that this is in relation to something I mentioned in the previous video. Oh, and by the way, I just listened to the previous video and I laughed because I mentioned that oil gets cleaned. No, we don't clean oil in our car, we change the oil in our car. So I meant to say change the oil in our car in order to get clean oil in the car so it doesn't damage the engine, right? And so the point I want to make now is to tie it into something that we talked about in earlier classes. So in the opening weeks of class, remember I had you guys looking very closely at the is-ought problem of Hume. And so interestingly enough, Olli Lagerspetz mentions the is-ought problem. I don't think he mentions David Hume in relation to it, but we can think of that, and this is what he raises, is that we can think of that in relation to how it is that we're understanding dirt, right? So when we're thinking about the is-ought problem, remember that we're having the distinction between what is the case and likewise what ought to be the case. So that's interesting because we sometimes will see things as dirty, but because something is dirty does not necessarily make it bad, right? So for instance, with the Statue of Liberty, the Statue of Liberty is green because it's copper with patina on it. So the question is the patina dirt? Is it a stain? Or is it something that it's a welcome stain? So in other words, it's not always clear that we have this distinction that dirt is bad, right? And so he also mentions that he knew a librarian where they had this fancy way of cleaning up books, and one of the fancy ways to clean up books had this special vacuum cleaner that would clean the book so well that you would start removing historical evidence from the book. So the question is, once you clean it to the degree where you're removing historical evidence, question mark, is that good, right? And I'm sure we could think of other examples of how it is that something that is dirty is not necessarily bad, right? So we might even just think of everyday examples, right? That sometimes just because your car is dirty, that doesn't necessarily make it bad, make you a bad person or make the car a bad thing, right? Because you could always get to washing it, and a dirty car is not that necessarily, it's not a value judgment on someone necessarily. Although I can see people taking it there for sure, right? So there is this, what he calls the naturalistic fallacy. So that naturalistic fallacy is another way of highlighting the is-ought problem. So with dirt and cleanliness, we could see that as having a connection. And I think that that's really important because it shows us that there's a difference between thinking about whether or not something is clean versus thinking about whether something is good, okay? Because sometimes we need dirt, right? So think of composting, likewise fertilizer, that sort of thing. So there's ways of thinking about dirt that are not always necessarily bad moral judgments, okay? Because something is dirty does not necessarily make it so that it is should be considered bad or evil, right? So then we have a question of how it is that dirt is in our everyday lives. So that's what's important for Olli Lagerspetz, and I agree with him that in the sense that I've been giving you everyday examples. So for our car, and then likewise we could also think of that in terms of pollution. But another more ominous connection as well that they touch on is this idea of racial purity. So in other words, someone might have illusions of racial purity because they see themselves as being cleaner than the race that they look down on, right? So the race that they look down on, they might think of as somehow dirtier and not as clean. And so that's where you get phrases like ethnic cleansing, that sort of thing. So this moral sense of how it is that we understand the clean and the dirty overlap into physical way in which we understand things that are clean and dirty, right? Because we might give a physical example of our moral attitude and then ask ourselves, well, can that be true that because someone is not as clean as me, when people are not as clean as me, does that automatically make them bad in a moral way? Can I then morally judge them as evil or morally corrupt or immoral, that sort of thing? So that's the interesting question that brings up, which I think has profound implications, right? Like the COVID-19 has us distancing ourselves from people to the degree that when we think people are too close to us, that's a bad thing, right? Because they're violating our space and therefore potentially infecting us. So we give that value judgment to it, but the question is that value judgment well-founded? It brings up interesting questions there, right? So there's a metaphysical sense of how it is that we understand dirt. And what I mean by that is that with metaphysics, we're understanding how things are related to each other. And so in this sense, we are related to things and people metaphysically in the sense that we're looking at how it is that we're related to those things by way of things that are clean and dirty, how it is that we manage those things, how is it that we present ourselves, how is it that we understand other people in terms of cleanliness and dirt, that sort of thing, right? And so what's at stake here also, and what's central to a lot of his argument, it seems, is this issue of care. So they talked about Martin Heidegger at the end of the podcast, who placed a lot of emphasis on care in terms of how it is that we're managing our lives philosophically, right? So in other words, care is a big thing for Martin Heidegger. But I don't want to talk about Martin Heidegger. I want to talk about feminism with regard to ethics of care, only to bring in the suggestion that we often think of the traditional role of women as being the gender who is more caring in terms of cleanliness, right? So oftentimes we don't think of men as clean as women, that sort of thing. So when we're thinking of feminism, though, we're challenging stereotypes of women to then challenge this idea that, well, can it be true that women are cleaner than men? Or likewise, that the priority of cleaning should be only something that should only be women's work, right? Because men have to keep themselves clean. Men have to present themselves in an orderly way. And likewise, we also are called to practice cleanliness ourselves and call into question this idea that we think somehow the only people that should be cleaning are women, right? Which is just ludicrous. And so this idea of feminism and the ethics of care also bring into regard how it is that we're thinking of something that is pure, right? So in other words, when we're thinking of feminism, one of the problems there is that feminism is challenging traditional norms that have us thinking about ideas of neutrality. So a pure, neutral, objective point of view tends to be looked at as more masculine, whereas a feminine, caring point of view might start thinking of how it is that we're considering people in terms of relations, so family members, that sort of thing, and also how it is that we're caring for people on an emotional level, right? Because traditional masculine ethics has us distilling emotion out of how it is that we're thinking of morality, whereas with feminism, we're asked to take into consideration how it is that we're regarding emotion. So in that sense, that emotional component becomes clearer and controversial by way of how it is that we're thinking of purity, right? Because we might think of something that is impure as being more emotional. So therefore, because it's more emotional, do not cut it out, right? So we could also think of babies, care of infants as that in other words, they tend to be acting emotionally in their lives. And then likewise, they also need a lot of physical cleaning as well, and physical maintenance of the infant. And that's usually thought of as women's work, but we want to call that into question because keeping things clean is not necessarily just women's work, because there's the obvious connection to the environment, right? That in other words, keeping the environment clean is not just women's work. It also has to do with how it is that we are all taking into consideration what it is that we should keep clean. So thank you, and that's it.